بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أهلا بكم. هنبتدي حالا فورا فعاليات المؤتمر بعد انتهاء الجلسة الختامية، وهنبتدي على طول إن شاء الله بالجلسة الثانية للمؤتمر. الجلسة الأولى هيتم تأجيلها باكر إن شاء الله نظرا لظروف وصول الخبراء من إيطاليا لتقديم البانل. فدلوقتي إن شاء الله هنبتدي فعاليات الجلسة الثانية. هيكون معانا في الجلسة الأستاذ براون رئيس المعهد الإنجليزي للعلاقات العامة، والدكتورة ليزا بيلجرام مدير أول البحوث الاستراتيجية للتنمية الدولية والإبداع الشامل بالجامعة المفتوحة Open University بالمملكة المتحدة. واسمحوا لي إن أنا أقدم دكتورة ليزا بشكل يعني أكثر تفصيلاً، وهي ستتولى إدارة الجلسة الثانية. دكتورة ليزا انضمت إلى جامعة Open University كمدير أول لمشروع المواطنة، وذلك بعد تقديمها لمشروع بحثي حول الاستشراق. وفي أكتوبر 2010 تقدمت للحصول على شهادة الدكتوراه في قانون الأسرة البريطانية للمسلمين. وخلال دراستها الجامعية حول الشرق الأوسط والإسلام في جامعة فيينا ركزت أبحاثها في قضايا الهجرة، والتحقت بيلجرام ببرنامج الدراسات العليا حول الهجرة وقانون الأقليات. كما ركزت ليزا أبحاثها على المملكة المتحدة والقانون الأوروبي على جمع شمل الأسرة والهجرة والجنسية، فضلاً عن بعض القضايا القانونية التي تؤثر على المجتمعات المسلمة في أوروبا. والآن نترك الستيج لدكتورة ليزا لإدارة هذه الجلسة. Thank you, Dr. Lisa, for joining us, and this is, you can start now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rania, for the introduction. I would like to thank Arado for inviting me to moderate the session today. I'm very pleased to be part of an excellent conference already and thoroughly enjoyed the first presentations this morning. And I'm sure we will continue in an equally interesting format this afternoon. I'd like to introduce to you Rob Brown, who's joining us from the UK for today's conference. Rob is managing partner of the PR and communications agency Rule 5. He's also the president of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. Rob wrote the first book on the impact of social media on public relations in the UK, which was published in 2008 and has the title of Public Relations and the Social Web. He currently also works with the Cabinet Office in the UK, where he is evaluating the capability of government communicators. Rob really is an expert in his field and has got many, many years of experience in PR and communications, specifically on social media. Rob will give a presentation for about 30 minutes, which will be followed by Q&A, where you will have the opportunity to ask him questions and to bring also his expertise that is focused on the UK, the US, and also Asia-Pacific case studies, to bring it to a local context, to Egypt and the Arab world. His presentation will examine specifically government and officials' engagement via social media. And as I said, he will use a few case studies to bring these theories to life that makes it engaging for us and make sure that we learn from his experience. Without further ado, may I hand over to Rob. The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope I got that okay. Thank you for inviting me today. If you use Twitter, I was an early enough user to get my actual name on Twitter, so please follow me. I will follow you back if you follow me today. It's very difficult when talking about social media to look forward and to establish what is going to happen in the future. None of us can do that. None of us has the capability of seeing how individuals, organisations, government officials will adapt their communications practice. But we do all have the advantage of having a rear-view mirror. So we can look backwards and we can make some very educated guesses as to how communications will evolve going forward based on what we can see going past. And looking to the past, we can establish first and foremost that social media communications is really, in the grand scheme of things, very, very new indeed. If we look just 10 years ago, fax machines were still often used. We still sometimes posted photographs, so hard copy photographs, to newspapers. Social media as a term was not in common use. Digital PR as a discipline was completely unheard of. And online newspapers were a novelty. That's just a decade ago. To evidence that, if we look at some of the social media channels from 10 years ago, Twitter was only months old. So Twitter was established in the summer of 2006. Facebook had no public access. So Facebook was used by students in the United States, but it wasn't used globally, and it wasn't available unless you had an email address from a university. There were no iPhones. It's hard to believe that just 10 years ago nobody had an iPhone, whereas I suspect there are many iPhones in this room today. And YouTube video was only a year old. So that's just 10 years ago. When we look at social media and social media in communications, one thing that we notice very clearly is that different people adopt at different rates. So the very first adopters were people like the working in the technology sector. Journalists used social media very early on as well because it was a way to find things out, to find out news, to find out things that there was no other channel of finding out. And public relations, for very similar reasons, many people working in public relations became early adopters of social media. But if we look at late adopters and the people that take much longer to come to use, officials, people working in governmental organisations are naturally small c conservative and therefore suspicious and concerned about some of the issues surrounding the openness of social media, and they fall into a very similar category to lawyers and to financial services. Now, there is plenty of data to establish that, but I know this to be true because I have a brother and a sister. My sister is a lawyer, and my brother is an investment banker working in London. And they're both younger than me, and they were both much later to social media than I was. In fact, my brother, who is very senior in investment banking in London, is doing things now that I was maybe doing 7 or 8 years ago with things like Twitter and LinkedIn. He is, however, much, much richer than me. There are exceptions, though, to politicians and political figures who took to social media early in the cycle. And the clearest one is Barack Obama. His election in 2008, many saw as being the first social media election. And it was remarkable for the change in the way that social media was used to communicate during that election, something that has been common in US elections ever since, but also in elections in many, many places around the world. In fact, the real success of social media for Barack Obama's first US election was his ability to raise money was greatly increased. Typically, politicians who were elected for the first time as president had to raise substantial amounts of money, primarily from a small number of large donors. Barack Obama's election was characterized by the fact that much of his campaign funding came from a very large number of small donors, and that was one of the key impacts of his presence on social media. Was he was able, and his campaign aides were able to make those requests for donations that way. And the other thing that was unique, although obviously it stopped soon after he became president, was that he was tweeting himself. So he was posting things as an individual. Obviously, as time goes on, people need advisors, public relations advisors in many cases, to assist with this kind of communications. But it was groundbreaking at the time. But if we also look to the US for some insight, at the time of Barack Obama's election, one of the most famous news anchors was Dan Rather, who's a name that will be familiar to many of you, certainly those that are my age and older. And he said that candidates genuinely hate audience participation because they like to control the environment. When faced with the idea that voters will ask them questions via a YouTube video, he says they get the shivers. I think that was true in 2008. I think it's true still now. So there is an issue around the accessibility of social media that causes people in public life to prefer to use other methods of communications. And there have been some huge changes to social media. In 2008, Barack Obama's election campaign made him the most popular individual, so he had the highest number of followers on that particular social network. Nowadays, it's entertainment people who occupy the upper echelons in terms of following, and they use it in a very different way. So I believe that's somebody called Katy Perry. Social media, however, has values for officialdom, and those values we can break down into a number of categories. The social capital that you gain is incredibly important. You can reach audiences directly without going through any intermediaries, so without having anyone moderating your comments in any way. So you can give people unfiltered information, which is a huge and important new development. There's an opportunity, of course, to listen as well as to transmit ideas. And that listening can take lots of forms. It can take a direct one-to-one basis, but also there are now tools that will aggregate people's comments on social media so that we can start to assess things like sentiment and broad opinions, and we can see where certain types of opinion might be trending or gaining strength or gaining traction. And the other thing, and one of the important things I want to talk about in this section, is that opportunity to gain and to build trust. And actually, trust is a very valuable commodity, because by gaining trust, we can often persuade people of our views and opinions in a way that is much more efficient and economic than using rules or exercising control. So trust is a very, very powerful commodity. I'd like to give you an example from Korea from 2015, where an academic study took place and looked at nearly 400 questionnaires from Koreans who had communicated with a government department via Twitter. And the study looked at these in depth and through the questionnaires asked people about their opinions, their sentiments, their reaction, their belief that their questions had been answered, and the level of trust that was produced as a result of those interactions. And it produced a very clear result that when senior, and the senior bit is important here, when senior government officials intervened in the discussions, it greatly increased their trust and their likelihood to believe and follow the information that they were given. There's a global PR consultancy that many people in the room will be familiar with called Edelman Public Relations, and Edelman annually produce a trust barometer. And looking at their trust barometer for 2016, we can see that actually trust has increased for all organisations over the last 5 years. But it's interesting to note that that trust is not increasing at the same rate across all populations. So the gap is increasing much more quickly with informed populations than it is within the wider populations and the community as a whole. So we look at that divide, and this is a graph taken from the 2016 Edelman report, going back over the last 5 years. We can see that 5 years ago, the gap between trust, and this is not just trust in government institutions, this is trust in what they describe as the four major institutions, so government, business, the media, and non-governmental organisations between 2012 and 2016. And we can see that, that for the mass population, trust still remains below 50% in those organisations, so it's risen from 44 to 48. But amongst informed publics, it's gone from 53, which is only just above the halfway mark, to 60%. So that suggests that there is a potential opportunity for direct channels and organisations working through those channels to gain the trust of populations to close that gap. What the informed populace does, the general population does tend to follow. That's not always the case. One of the things that I also like to talk to you about today is about the pace of change in social media. So I was asked a question earlier in the coffee section about whether having a website and possibly a Twitter account is sufficient in terms of engaging with publics. And I would say it might have been 5 years ago. It almost certainly isn't anymore, and it certainly won't be in the future. Although, as I said, I refer to my rear view mirror as being more effective than my future gazing. But there is a lot of evidence to show that the pace of change isn't, in fact, slowing. So we can't relax and feel that now that we have social media channels and we have the ability to communicate with people in different ways, that we don't need to think about how it might evolve in the future. So we need to wake up. Change is unpredictable, but we can safely predict that change doesn't stop. So I'd like to talk to you briefly about some of the ways that it is changing and some of the opportunities that I think that presents. One thing that officials and organisations have at their hands is data and access to data. And one of the things that we've been seeing where I live in the UK is the government's open data programme. So making data that normally would have been in a filing cabinet or sat on a computer in somebody's office actually open to the public, so that academics or journalists can use that data to build their own picture around situations. Releasing data in that way, and in a controlled way certainly, but releasing data is a powerful way, an increasingly powerful way to communicate with people online. Data drives news, so a lot of news is driven by statistical information that data provides. Data provides constant feedback, so it changes the campaign cycle. So by releasing data and discussing data and putting it into the open, we can create a continuous improvement loop. And data has also played a part in the way we evaluate our communications activities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about analytics, and again, why social media is really important for analytics. Historically, when I started in public relations, this is how we used to measure the effectiveness of what we did. We took the number of articles, how big those articles were, perhaps the circulation for those newspapers, and that gave us the sum total of the information that we had. Highly ineffective way of finding out the impact of communications activity. Now we have all sorts of ways of doing that. So we can use things like Google Analytics on websites to establish where people come from. There are native insights on most of the social media platforms. So Facebook has a very effective insights platform. There are third-party applications that are widely available, in many cases freely available on freemium models, where the actual cost of The platform is relatively low, but you can get huge amounts of exceptionally valuable information about the impact of your communications. And I think this is one of the most important reasons why organisations should treat social and digital channels as critical to the way that they communicate. Increasingly, although we are doing more detailed evaluation, communicators are looking at real-world evaluation as well. So what do people actually think? What do people do? How do they behave? And increasing components. The other thing about social media is it's elevating the importance of ethical practice. So in a world where there is greater transparency, communicators have to and need to, because the level of scrutiny is much greater, become concerned about the ethics of those communications. And that takes the role of the communicators in this room and all around the world into an important new place where they can offer strategic counsel. So when they're talking to senior groups of people about not just how they communicate, but what they do and how they do it in order to present the correct image for their organisation. Visual communications, I think, is one of the most critical ways in which the world is changing. So the PR industry, when I began working in it, in the communications industry, was primarily about the written word. So it was about, you know, for cases of many people in the room, it was and still is often about press releases. So text-based communication. This is changing at an extraordinarily rapid rate. And it's changing because of the availability of technology, both the hardware but also the software technology that allows people to communicate in a visual way. So still images are still incredibly important, but the way in which those still images are managed and controlled. So when I first worked in the industry, a photographer would take a picture, it would go to a laboratory, we might get a contact sheet back in a day. That contact sheet, we'd select some pictures, it would go back to the laboratory. It would be 4 or 5 days before you could put a photograph in the hands of a newspaper. In the last 10, 15 years, that's been reduced to a matter of hours or even minutes. But actually managing that is critically important. So how do we manage the visual communications? And that is now extending into video. So video is the #1 growth area in social media, and I think the area where communicators at every level need to focus increased attention. There are 4 billion video views per day on YouTube. Facebook has more than 8 million, is growing at a considerable rate. In fact, growing at a much faster rate than YouTube is. And those figures are currently at least trebling annually. So the consumption of video is significantly important. And newspapers, insofar as they exist still, always have online components. And for those online components, they need to get eyeballs, so they need to get views, they need people to see them. And video is driving that. So editorial statistics in newspapers editorial decisions are being driven by the volume statistics, and those volume statistics are being driven by video. So newspapers now, so the thing that we felt that was most text-based, also increasingly want video content. And that's why, because increasingly all over the world, people have the ability to consume that video in their pockets, wherever they go, wherever they are. And that is by far, I was talking to Lisa earlier about demographics and access. For many of us, certainly if you're my age, I quite, and you know, being aware of spectacles now, I quite like a laptop to be able to watch. I like being able to do that, but actually, it's really critical that we have communications platforms that work at that level on the mobile phone, because that is where the volume audience is. So, thank you very much. I'd very much like to take your questions.